Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the second episode of Conversations. I'm happy today to have somebody who has a very long career in the industry, and we are going to be talking about his career as an AC, a camera operator, and also as a cinematographer. And I'm going to have you just start to talk a little bit about how you started getting into all of this stuff.
Okay. Back in high school, I started doing animation and a little bit of special effects, and that's what really drew me into filmmaking. So I decided I wanted to go to film school, and I applied for University of Southern California, and I didn't get in right away, but I decided to go as a general education major, and within a few semesters, I was in the film school.
So you didn't get into the film school right away? Is that the way it worked, or?
It was, and still is, of course, extremely competitive. I think at the time it was like 1 in 60 or something like that, or maybe it was 10 in several hundred, and got in, and I was able to get in by reapplying, and ended up in the program. And what I discovered was, at the time, I was sort of interested, because I liked sculpting and drawing. I thought visual effects or animation would have been a way to go. But after finally being saturated with great films while at film school, I decided that that's the direction I wanted to go: live drama, comedy, anything I could do at that point.
And were you drawn to the camera department initially, or did you think it was going to be a different discipline in terms of what you were going to be interested in doing?
Well, I wasn't a photographer per se. I did some photography, but I was visuals, and so camera was one of the areas that I pursued. And it turned out that I had some aptitude for it, and I really enjoyed it. And so that's what I finally decided to put all my efforts into.
And was that because you were not only drawn to it, but you started to get pulled into projects and you became the default cinematographer? Or was it something that you consciously said, I'm being exposed to all of these different disciplines, and this is the one that I'm going to go after? Because I'm assuming, I might be wrong because I didn't go to film school, that at least in people's minds, directing and cinematography are two of the disciplines that people are going to be drawn to the most. So how does that work in a film school environment in terms of it being so competitive as well, once you're actually in and doing the practical side of things?
So your second description was the more accurate one. I was shooting projects, but I just felt like it was a natural fit. So it was through the normal instruction, I realized that this is the way I should go. It's what I liked. It brought me onto projects that the thing that really affects me the most, oddly enough, in motion pictures is great acting and great writing. And you don't really see that as much if you pursue a career in special visual effects or special makeup effects. So I realized that I had sort of outgrown, in a way, no disrespect towards special effects people. I had outgrown my interests in effects and really wanted to pursue cinematography for drama and drama and comedy and so forth.
Yeah. So one of the things that you talked to me about, and we'll go back to the slides here and kind of go through some of this, is that when you were in film school, you were not only working on projects that were film school projects, but you actually started to work on actual films. And right now we have Trying Times up, and we can also maybe talk a little bit about Thriller. And can you talk to me a little bit about how you started to work in the industry when you were in film school and what you were doing in those?
Sure. As the school progressed, I finished most of my liberal arts education and just had more free time. And so I was probably doing, two short classes a semester at that point. So I had time to really get into to try to get work. And at that point, I was a fearless film student and was applying to things. But one of the big advantages of going to a film school, and you don't need to, obviously, but it has certain advantages. And one is that your peers, you can all help each other. You're an instant network. So I had a friend in film school put me up for a job that he wasn't able to do, which was a second camera assistant on a PBS pilot that Jonathan Demme, who wasn't extremely well known at the time, but he was known, was directing. And I was really excited because I had just seen Stop Making Sense, the Talking Heads documentary.
And so what were you doing on that film?
I was the only second assistant camera person. There was no loader, no anything else below me for two cameras, two 16-millimeter cameras, which was for a person, especially a person who wasn't that experienced, was extremely challenging.
And so you're in the camera department at school. Did you learn those skills when you were there and at least have some sense of what you're supposed to do? And by the way, can you also explain what your responsibilities were at that time shooting on film as a second AC?
Sure, of course. Yeah, I was. I had loaded and threaded many different types of cameras, which was one of the advantages of USC, that they had a big variety of cameras. It wasn't a particularly well-funded film school at the time. It was an old horse stables, I think, that were from the teens or 1920s or something. And they just around the time I was graduating, they built their first real building, impressive building. But they had only one Airflex SR camera at the time, and then every other camera was like an NPR. And there were just a variety of different cameras. So I had a lot of experience in that sense. I knew how to thread maybe 7 different styles of magazines. As a second, if you don't have a loader, your responsibilities are slating, the sticks, and keeping records, conferring with the script supervisor on what shot number is up and if there are any issues. You keep the camera reports. In some cases, you also do the time cards for the whole department. And then you hand the magazine off to the first assistant camera, who actually threads it onto the camera. But in this case, it was an SR, so it's just a matter of snapping the magazine in and making sure that it's catching correctly and threaded correctly. So it was for 2 cameras rolling on big dining room scenes and so forth. So we were burning through a lot of film. It was really crazy, and other people had to sometimes jump in and do the slate while I was in the changing bag, flipping the film to the next magazine.
Cool. So when you're doing that then, and now you look at that job now, because not only are you still a cinematographer and working on sets, you're obviously working with digital cameras and digital cinema cameras, and you're also, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, also teaching cinematography at a university, or trying to, based on what's going on right now. Has that role of a loader and then a second and a first changed dramatically? How has it shifted in terms of what the expectation is on a narrative, episodic or feature film, changed?
Obviously, when you go to a bigger budget, there's more people in the department. So not everyone, like a film loader, would normally load the film and keep the records on film. I'm not sure who does the time cards these days. But yes, it's changed quite a bit. For one thing, you have monitors involved, and that's sometimes the responsibility of the camera department. There's it sort of depends on how elaborate the playback systems are and so forth. I would say that there may be more paperwork. You have to deal with the cards, which are essentially magazine, the memory cards. So it's really not that different. It's just you don't have to worry about the door on the magazine opening up in the daylight. So is of course was a huge issue, and I think almost everyone flashed at least one can of film in their day.
Cool. Okay, so let's go back to, so you had Trying Times, first feature that you worked on, or first?
Oh, one more thing about Trying Times.
Yeah, go ahead.
There were a couple kind of wonderful things about it. One was that I was a huge David Byrne fan, and it was his first acting roles. I never spoke to him, but it was just really fun to be in his presence and see him get his confidence in acting. The second is that the first assistant camera on this was a gentleman from New York named David Dunlap, who had a pretty impressive career up to that point, but he was a NABIT camera assistant. And while we were standing there, he was talking, he and I think the boom operator were talking, and he was telling us he was trying to get on this film that was starting up for Martin Scorsese called After Hours. And he had no connection to the director of photography, which was Michael Ballhaus, doing his first movie for Scorsese. And Jonathan Demme, the director, happened to walk by and just said, "What are you talking about?" And he just offhandedly David mentioned what he was saying. And about 5 minutes later, Jonathan Demme walked by the other direction. Without even looking at him, he just slapped David on the arm and said, "Just talk to Michael Ballhaus. You have the job." So just an incredibly generous man, really nice man. And that started David on an amazing career that included operating on Goodfellas and shooting second unit on a ton of movies, including Forrest Gump. And he was also shot the movie director of photography on Shaun of the Dead. And through a weird coincidence, we're co-teachers at this school I'm at right now.
That's cool. Wow. Well, thank you very much, Rob, for the super chat. Just to give a shout out here. It's the coffee fund we get here when we do live streams. So much appreciated. So that's cool. So let's go ahead and talk about this other project that I have lined up here that you got yourself into when you were still at film school, which is Thriller. And can you tell me a little bit about this?
Sure. I also was interested in makeup special effects because of my sculpting background. So I had a friend at school named Tony Gardner, who is now a successful makeup effects artist. And he, through various means, managed to become the production assistant for the makeup effects lab, Rick Baker's makeup effects lab on Thriller. But then they needed another full-time makeup effects artist, so they bumped him up. And he called me to see if I wanted to be the shop PA. So I became the shop production assistant. And that was, I don't remember exactly how long. It was at least a month of pre-production. And then when we started shooting, the show went union, so I wasn't allowed to work on it. But they let us all of the makeup effects people got to be background extras, and some of them were featured. Like these are mostly the makeup effects shop people around Michael Jackson and in the image. But I wasn't a featured creature. I was just sort of a background one. So before the dancing begins, I'm a green furry zombie wearing a black vest and a white shirt. And so that was a big thrill.
And it was really one of the most ambitious music videos that had been done up until that time, for sure. It sounds like everybody has probably seen that music video, but the production was done at such a large scale. Was it like a month and a half in total with everything to put that all together? Because you said it was a month leading up to it.
Yeah. I think the shoot was maybe 5 days, 4 or 5 days, so maybe 6 weeks.
Yeah. Amazing. People make entire feature films in 6 weeks. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
For a lot less money.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. So now you're kind of coming to the end of film school. You're getting on some sets.
Mhm.
and you are studying to be and starting to do projects that are, in the realm of camera department, cinematography. And let's get into, if you're okay with it, we'll go back to the slides here, this next slide, and talk about this film, Biohazard, and tell me a little bit about how you got involved in this one.
Sure. It was I had applied to do makeup effects earlier on a film for this low budget filmmaker at the time, Fred Olin Ray, and Fred was a good guy, and but then I decided, and he actually hired me for the job, but then I decided I didn't want to leave school. So about a year later, I went over the weekend on his next film. I visited the set with some friends of mine, and they had it was their first day of shooting, and I walked up to the first assistant camera and said, I'll work for free if I could work in camera, because at that point I knew camera was my chosen field. And it just so happened that his girlfriend was working as the second assistant camera, and didn't want to do it. So he hired me on the spot. I started the next morning, and it was a weekends only 14-day feature. And it was what was crazy about it. Well, there are many things crazy about it. I think the entire budget was $50,000, and it was 35 millimeter. And the cameras were either rented very cheaply or borrowed on weekends from different rental houses. And they about maybe a third into the shoot, for various reasons, the first assistant was let go or left. I'm not clear on that. And I became the first assistant camera. No idea what I was doing. Didn't know focus pulling was hard, so I wasn't worried about it at all. And then at some point we changed to a different director of photography. I think they ran out of money for a while, and then when they started up again, it was a gentleman named Paul Elliott, who is a director of photography to this day, a very talented one. And he was shooting everything at like 1.8.
Oh, goodness.
And I didn't know that was difficult, so I kept at it. Then the second to last day of shooting, it was all weekends. I showed up, and I didn't see Paul there, and the director walked up to me and said, "Do you have a light meter?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "We couldn't afford Paul today, and would you mind being the director of photography?" So I called up my roommates and had them drive out and be my crew, and for the last 2 days I was the director of photography. So in 12 days I moved up from second AC to director of photography. So I had done, in my first year in the film business, I had done worked with Jonathan Demme. I had worked on Thriller, and I was a director of photography on a feature film, as it were. And so I thought this was the greatest industry in the world. You know, I had it made, and reality sunk in a little shortly after that.
So did you then go on to work on other films as a director of photography? Or because at a certain point you did start ACing more regularly on films. So how did that all kind of start and become steady work?
Well, on Fred's next project, they needed to raise money, so they shot maybe a 15-minute, I don't remember exactly, 15 or 20-minute promo for it, which was, the intention was to actually use that as part of the movie. So I shot that, and it did sell, but it sold to a company that wanted to up the budget to more like $250,000. So they insisted on a more experienced director of photography. So I got bumped down again to first assistant camera, and it was Paul Elliott once again as director of photography. And I just ended up working with Paul as his assistant for several projects in a row with Fred Ray. And we also, I would get to shoot second unit and inserts and that sort of thing on a regular basis because Paul would be busy or whatever. So I it was still that. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about no budget filmmaking, is that there's endless possibilities. You can be the set PA one day and the director the next day. I mean,
Right.
it just works that way. So I even if the movies are kind of silly or distasteful or whatever, it's a great way to get experience fast.
So you finished that one up, or that series of films, and it seems like you're now kind of flip flopping between being a first and then also and being in the camera department, but also getting to flex your muscles, being a second unit and shooting other stuff for the cinematographers you're working with. And then you get onto a film like this, and we have 18 again. You want to tell me a little bit about this and what you did on this film, and any stories that are fun to talk about?
Sure. So on a recommendation from Paul Elliott, I started working with this uh, at the time fairly known director of photography named Stephen Katz, who was who had shot a lot of B movies in his time, but shot quite often for John Landis. So he was the director of photography on the Blues Brothers movie. And because of that movie going almost double over budget, and they couldn't really touch John Landis, they decided to blacklist Stephen. So for like 2 years, he didn't get a feature. And so when he finally did get to work again, it was on a Julie Corman feature on Catalina Island that I worked on. And we hit it off, and I did several more low budgets. And then he got this film, which was a bigger budget, how would I describe it? A bigger budget non-union film, which were somewhat common at the time. It was several million. And it was a body swap movie. There was a run of body swap movies at that time.
I saw it when I was younger. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So it's supposed to be George Burns and his grandson, who's timid, swap bodies through I forget even now what the mechanism was. And then suddenly the grandson has all this confidence because he's George Burns and life is good. And that movie was significant for me because it went union. So fairly inexperienced first assistant camera, I got to enter the union. I think I'd been doing it maybe 4 years at that point. So it was a great break for me. It was really hard to get in the union at that time, harder than it is now.
Interesting. So when we take a look at this frame here, this is obviously, an 80s comedy film, and talking about it just from the approach from lighting and, obviously the sensibilities of whoever the cinematographer is. What type of instruments were you using back then? What was sort of the marching orders? Because we see comedies now that are really not necessarily lit the same way that, comedies back then were being lit, and films in general. So what was kind of the standard when you were shooting a film like this?
Oh boy, that's a good question. For cameras, I remember because I was camera assistant, and so I believe this one was Movie Cam Super America, which I don't even know if they're Arri bought Movie Cam in order to make use of their technology and have incorporated it in their film cameras for many years. But the lighting, Stephen was. His heyday was probably the 1970s, or at least his teeth were cut in the 70s. So he mixed soft light and hard light much more so than we do these days. I can't really remember, or maybe I wasn't even paying attention because it was the biggest thing I'd ever worked on. So I don't really remember the specifics about lighting, but I do know more hard light than you would expect.
Right. And when did that trend start to change, when you started to see that there was really much more of a push in general towards soft light? Because, you look at a lot of the films even in the 80s, and there's a lot of hard light in those films. Right. Was it sort of in the 90s that you started to see that transition? Because it didn't just happen with digital. There seems to be sort of an overall transition that occurred.
I think it was European films that really changed changed it for us all when we started seeing movies like Days of Heaven and so forth. There were also these cameramen who were coming in who were of European backgrounds, like Philippe Rousselot and Miroslav Andrzejczyk and so forth, who lit most of their movies with Chinese or paper lanterns.
Yep.
And so I think that was really what started convincing people. That and probably Barry Lyndon, that was such an influence on the film industry.
Yeah.
So the more visionary American cinematographers jumped on that right away. And, I'm thinking of people like Caleb Deschanel and so forth. And then everyone else sort of slowly joined in. And some people still mix hard and soft, but you don't see a lot of people keying faces with hard light these days. It's pretty rare.
Yeah. So I do want to let everybody know, because we do have some people here in the chat. If you have a question for Scott, please put it in the chat, because we're happy to answer them as we go through this conversation. And that's also why we do it live, so that you can ask those questions. So as they bring up frames or Scott's talking about something, feel free to throw that into the chat, and then we'll go from there, which will be great. Good. So I think something's coming up here.
Yes.
For Scott, why is it easier to get into the union now versus the late 80s, and should be easier in, should easier be in quotes is the question.
There is an actual process now where you can use your non-union days to get into the union, and the quotes is a good suggestion, because it's certainly not easy now. But back then, the union had only been opened up due to, I believe, a lawsuit by a handful of cinematographers, including Caleb Deschanel and Stephen Katz. And they basically sued to get in, and also to make the union a little more reasonable about people getting in, because it was just a boys' club, and it was basically you had to be somebody's relative to get in at that point. So it was easier than it had been maybe 5 years earlier, but it was still quite difficult. There just was no really rule on the books about how to get in. So if a film happened to go union, then you could get in. That was, I guess, why I would say it was easier, but it's certainly not easy.
Cool. Keep those questions coming, and we're just going to keep going through your career, and we're going to hit the next film, and we're going to talk about Space Invaders. How'd you get on this one, and what was that like?
Well, I also did some special effects work, and worked I had a friend at school who's now a god of special effects. His name is John Knoll, and he's the creative head of ILM now.
Oh yeah,
and
we know that name.
Yeah, and his brother wrote Photoshop, and he had an involvement in it too. So he was working at a model shop and got me in there, and I met a friend of his named Patrick Reed Johnson. And Patrick was a very ambitious director wannabe at the time, and so he finally got a break, and a script he had co-written with a good friend of his, Scott Alexander, ended up getting okayed, but for a fairly low budget, I think $1.5 million or something. And so we all pitched in multiple roles. So I was technically the second unit director and director of photography. And I ended up shooting miniatures too, and although John Knoll did all the good ones, all the ones that required motion control, and it was a great experience, but just brutal. I mean, I got a job on it was barely paid, and I got a job on a music video in New Mexico, I think, that was leaving in a day and a half, or maybe 2.5 days, and I had to finish what I was doing before I left for the job, because they had to use it on screens within the spaceship. So I did a 42-hour workday on that. Never gone more than 22 hours before or since. So it was a crazy but wonderful experience. And I found myself helping build models and doing all sorts of stuff. So it was a great experience.
And we talked about second in terms of camera assistant. What is the relationship between the cinematographer and a second unit and being a cinematographer in that unit? Talk to me about, obviously, just like working with directors, it's going to depend on the director and their working style. But for you, when you're working second unit on something, as opposed to being, the cinematographer for the film, you're still tasked with creating frames that fit cohesively with everything. So how early do you, whether you're the cinematographer and you have a second unit or you're on the second unit and you're running that, how do you like to work? And, what do you think is the best way for that to actually work well for people if they get the opportunity to be in second unit?
Good question. I like to, I always, as soon as I get the job, I contact the director of photography. It depends if I'm hired by that person or not. Sometimes, in a few cases, I was hired by the director, including this one. So I wanted to make sure I had an okay relationship with the director of photography and that we had a line of communication. I made sure that he knew that I wasn't trying to compete in any way, that I just wanted my footage to match his and to work within the confines of the look of the film. So I talked to him constantly. I mean, constantly is an exaggeration, but as often as I could. And often we would come in and do our second unit when they were asleep. So I would show up about an hour before wrap, and I would try to corner him when I could and say, "We're doing this. This is what I'm thinking of as an approach. What do you think about that?" And he would. And there was one miniature that was really too small to really work, and we could never get that one to work properly. And he came in and made a suggestion, and it's a lot better. It's usable in the film. So fortunately, it was James Carter is his name, and he's a excellent working director of photography right now. So it was. Yeah, I mean, I would say as a director of photography, I try to do the converse. I try to be as supportive to the second unit as I can. I make sure that they have all the information they need, that they have the clips they need to match to, that they know what kind of units. I put them in touch usually with the electrical best boy so that they can actually get the same practical units and lighting units rather that we used for the original shoot. It's really rare that you would do an insert or a second unit shot that is before the main unit shoots, but sometimes that can be very tricky. So in that case, you really need a lot of input from the director of photography.
Got it. And so are you usually getting to see, some of that footage before you shoot those inserts and that other stuff? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the normal way is to go in with both film, video clips and stills, higher resolution stills, and that way you can say, oh, okay, it looks like there's a cooler light, harder light hitting from the back right, and that sort of thing. So
yeah,
so
because you're not always on set, and are you sometimes being brought in just for part of the film as well? I'm assuming.
Almost.
Okay. Cool. All right, let's get on to some other films. Now we start to get into some pretty interesting frames. So let's go ahead and jump to this next, section, and we're going to talk about that and kind of see where we go. So, Wild at Heart, how did you get onto this? And you can just tell us what you can about the film and sort of what you were doing. Yeah.
Yeah, my first day, so I got a call to do B camera as a first assistant camera person about, I don't know how long into the film it was, probably several weeks. It wasn't a long shoot. It was a fairly tight budget. And Fred Elms was shooting it. And the first assistant was, it was forgetting. Wow, it's been so long. Rob Sweeney, who's now an excellent director of photography in his own right. And sorry, Rob. And it was just so exciting to me because I've been a huge David Lynch fan since Eraserhead, which I worked at a movie theater in high school that showed it as a midnight movie, and I had seen it probably a dozen times. So just watching him and seeing how funny and quick he was just a joy. And my first day, we had it was in the I think the Park Plaza Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, and there was a scene where there's a fight on the stairs, and Nicolas Cage bashes somebody's head against the stairs or something, and the guy's brains are supposed to fall out, but they hadn't made a decision yet. And just to see how that proceeded was, David Lynch does a lot of creating on the spot, and that was just a fascinating thing to see.
Cool. So what was the approach technically from a lighting standpoint on this film? And obviously you and I have spoken about this a little bit, and we both know Dan Neese, who was on the film as a Steadicam op. And so what was his approach as a director, and what was he looking for in terms of, you know, the way this film was shot, in terms of obviously composition, lighting, you know, camera movement? I'd love to just hear a little bit about that, if that's okay.
Well, I'm the B camera focus puller, so I'm not right there with the director that often.
Yeah.
Plus, I didn't start the show, so I didn't know. I wasn't in on those discussions at all. And sometimes, even as an A camera assistant, you don't hear a lot of them. These two shots, by the way, are scenes that I worked on, which is why I chose them. And they were, I think, in Riverside. I think we filmed in Riverside. There's a shot where someone's hand gets blown off and a dog goes running down the track with the hand in its mouth, and we filmed our camera filmed that particular shot. And I worked with Catherine Colson. She was my operator, and she went on to be, or I guess previous to that, had been the log lady in Twin Peaks. And, she was very multi-talented. She was a camera operator as well for news programs like 2020. I'm not sure that specific one, but that type of work. And she's also an actress and an acting teacher. So she was a really talented person, really wonderful too. Anyway, the one thing that happened at this location, if you can go back to the wider shot before the close-up, there was some like graffiti on the wall. And at the time when we walked in, it was just kind of a boring room. And David, who is his own on-set painter, often decided he needed to add something. So they rolled in this big wooden cart, and we all sat around watching as David added that graffiti to the right. And I'm trying to read what it says, but I can't quite read it. Anyway, so he did that while we waited. It didn't take long, of course. And then we proceeded to keep going. And I would say that his films are much more personal than most films that I've worked on. You feel like you're part of the family. Okay, I'll answer Rob Christensen's question. The question is, what do you take from your indie cinematographer projects to the industry camera operator gigs, and vice versa? I would say not that much for the operating gigs, but the shooting gigs, which aren't listed. It's far from complete on my IMDb list. But I learned a lot of very quick techniques for lighting, and also to have confidence in my lighting and my light meter. So I found myself on my second indie feature, at times we just didn't have a stand-in. So I would light to my meter and then bring the actors in and roll. So it was, and also I still used paper lanterns a lot because, for a quick, cheap, soft source, they're wonderful for no budget filmmaking. Drives gaffers crazy, especially young gaffers who were mentored and think that the way that they were mentored is the only way to work. I've worked with several cameramen that like to take either a Chinese lantern or a paper lantern, excuse me, or now you can use like one of those flex lights, LEDs, and put them on a boom pole and follow the actors around with it so that they have a constant source. And I've had young gaffers say, "That's crazy. They don't do that in real movies." And I've seen people do it in real movies probably a dozen times. So my advice to you is what you think is acceptable and what you don't think is acceptable on a big feature film is probably incorrect. Just keep your mind open to everything.
And from your standpoint, when it comes to cinematography, what's your general approach now as a cinematographer? I know it changes from film to film and the director you're working with, but what's kind of, where do you lean and what's your preferred way of working?
It varies. I mean, I like to operate, but I'm completely open to having an operator when it makes more sense. And I teach that also. I try to break people's preconception about such things. My students, I'm like, you may really enjoy operating and enjoy the fact that you get complete control, but learn how to express that control. I would say my approach is project-based. So I'll have long discussions with the director, and once we have an idea, then I'll decide on what lighting units and what feel, and then stick with it, and also a discussion with the gaffer, and then we go from there. So, but if it has an indie feel to it, the project, if it's supposed to have an indie feel or an edgy feel, then I'm happy to go with smaller or cheaper or even practicals, for the lighting of that film. I've never been a lighting snob. I'm sort of obsessed with gear, as I know you are, Jim. And I'm happy to try out like cheap, lights ordered from overseas and that sort of thing. So I'm very much about light quality. Like I have preferences in bounce material and in diffusion and things like that.
Can you talk a little bit about that, if that's all right? Just a few of them. I prefer beadboard over foam core. I love to bounce off of or use as diffusion muslin. And I know that for me, bleached muslin sometimes seems a little cool. So I'll either throw a little, straw or orange on it, like an eighth or something. And, or use unbleached muslin, of course. I do like warm light. I like it a little too much, so I have to break myself of that because it's not always appropriate for the project. As far as I don't do much hard lighting, but I do. When I do, I tend to put like a light Hampshire frost or something like that on the light, just because I don't like the crispness of like a Fresnel or an oak. If you need a really sharp shadow, we do the old trick of opening up the Fresnel and just using the globe in a tungsten unit. But that's a few things. Nothing else is coming to mind right now. Okay. And when you're working as the cinematographer on a project, do you prefer a smaller crew or do you like having a bigger department that's working under you? Is there a preference? Because when I shoot, I tend to have smaller crews. That's what I'm used to. But unfortunately, I often have too small of crews. So I tend to now be a pretty good judge of what we actually need out of necessity. And often I'm not given that option. But when I do get to shoot a bigger thing, such as a second unit, having a good sized crew is really helpful. If it's too big, when you do location moves, it slows you way down, and that can be a real problem. We're kind of having that problem at the film schools, and the students tend to hire a 50-person crew because they can, and they don't have to pay them, obviously. So, right.
So it tends to slow everything down and cause organizational problems. So we're thinking about stripping down the crews to a maximum of maybe 30, something like that, and less if possible. So it really depends. There's some, if I'm doing a multi-camera thing, obviously I need full crews for every camera and so forth.
Right.
But there's like directors like David Fincher who doesn't believe in a big crew, and often there'll be 2 or 3 cameras going with 1 second AC, that kind of thing. So everyone's got their own way of working.
And speaking of cameras, some DPs like to work single camera, and that's their approach. Others love to just, spray the set or the location with lots of cameras. And I'm sure part of it has to do with the type of film you're making. But do you prefer, as a cinematographer who's also operating, to work with one camera, or what's your preference, if there is any?
I consider that the director's prerogative, not mine.
Okay.
Ultimately, it's easier to light for one camera, as everyone knows, but I've learned a lot of tricks over the years, and also I do a lot of top lighting. I know a lot of people don't like it, but I quite do. So when you're top lighting multiple cameras is a lot easier. And I learned, early on how to do 2 cameras. So that's very easy for me. When you get beyond 2 cameras, it can be really tricky. But I don't have a strong preference. I've worked with, I won't name names, but I have several directors of photography who hate multiple camera and will do everything they can to stop it. And what's bad about that is I've worked as their B camera operator quite a bit. So on their shows, if they get their way, I don't work that much. So
interesting.
But going with a looser lighting style and doing multiple cameras is fine by me. I think some beautiful work has been done that way.
Cool. So let's sort of talk about transition. I'm having a little bit of difficulty with some of the slides, but the conversation is the most important part of it anyway. So you are working as on your own projects for other people as a cinematographer, but you also sort of have this whole path from the 80s through the 90s, primarily as a first, as a camera assistant. And then somewhere as you start to transition into the early 2000s, you really start to get opportunities on bigger films to start and bigger projects to start operating. And can you tell me about that transition, how it happened, and was it you thinking about it and wanting it to happen, or was it something that just sort of came about?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that I in a way I made it happen. I at that point I felt very confident about my focus pulling and my camera assisting, so I knew it was time to get on to bigger projects, more interesting projects, I should say. So I had done 18 again and some other films of some size, and I had a friend call me to tell me about, she's a second AC, to tell me about a project that was coming to town. They didn't have camera assistants, English DP, and it was kind of wide open, and she wanted to be the second on it. And so I said, great, I'll do that. And so I just sent in a resume cold, and I was on a TV movie at the time, so I could only go in on a Saturday, and their production office was in Venice. So I drove to Venice, and I was in a great mood because I didn't really expect to get the job, because there are so many, I knew there'd be people with more experience up against me. And I just really wanted to meet this young director of photography because he had shot 2 stunning movies, Sid and Nancy in 1984, which both blew me away. And so I get there, and obviously it was Roger Deakins, and this movie was Barton Fink. And this was his first time to work with the Coen brothers. And I get to the office, the office was closed for the weekend, so he was the only one there, and I was his last interview. And he had someone in mind already to hire. And as we're talking, he was a little bit, I wouldn't say shy, but a little reserved, I guess, or I don't know. Maybe it was just weird to be one-on-one with someone in the office. But anyway, we seemed to hit it off, and I suddenly realized that I'd been there over an hour talking to him, and he went through he said, so let's go through your resume. You're like me. No one's heard of your credits. So I went through, and there was this one that I had done with Shelley Johnson, who's an amazing cameraman who I still work with today. And I had assisted him on several projects at that point, mostly TV movies. But the first one was this thing called Everybody's Baby. It's about the little girl who fell down the well in Texas. And it was actually a really good experience and a cool little TV movie. And so I'm explaining it, and I said, this one's sort of like, like In Cold Blood or Badlands, in the sense that it's a reenactment of a real event in a sort of docudrama fashion, but really in an interesting way. And I did mention that those were two of my favorite movies, Badlands and In Cold Blood. And then so like another half hour passes, and I'm about to leave, and he says, have you read the script? Why don't I get you the script? And I'm thinking, whoa, do I have a shot at this? and then he comes back, hands me the script, and he says, In Cold Blood is my favorite movie. And I'm like silently going, yes, And so I, in fact, he just, as I'm walking out, he goes, oh, what the hell, you're hired. He wasn't going to tell anyone for a week. So it was a great experience. It was intense. It was really, really challenging. And I would say it was a revelation for me, because I had these weird ideas about lighting that I don't know how I came up with them, maybe just through experimenting and watching foreign films and better American films. And this was the first time where I actually saw them in action. And so I really, I paid as much attention as I could to the way he lit, and although I was kept very, very busy. And it was just, epiphany after epiphany. So it was just a remarkable experience.
Hmm. And you did work with him again later in your, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't work with him for a while. I mean, we got along really well, but he had his own regular first in New York, and then he moved his second up to first, and that's his first assistant to this day. Yeah. And is just an amazing guy, Andy Harris, and really, really excellent focus puller. So I think the world of the guy. And years later, I was working with his wife, who was a script supervisor at the time, on a commercial, and he came by and visited the set, and so we became a little bit reacquainted. And then maybe a year after that, he called me up for pickups on The Village, 3 days of pickups on The Village, and I had moved up to operator, but not officially through the union. But I was like, of course I'll do that. And so I took the job, and we got along well, and I told him I was operating now. And so that led to, I guess, one we'll talk about in a little while. In order to become a camera operator, I almost had to force it, because I kept working with directors of photography who operate for themselves, like Deakins and Peter Deming, who we were just about to get to, who hired me to be the first AC on Lost Highway, another David Lynch thing, partly because he knew I had worked on Wild at Heart. They don't move people up because they are the operator, and they're very, very particular about operating. So I ended up, but Shelley Johnson let me operate, and I got to operate on Goldmember, the third Austin Powers movie, because with Peter Deming, I had done those movies, and all three of those movies. And the director was someone I knew from film school, Jay Roach. And so he suggested that I be the B camera operator when I'm not the first. When we have two cameras on Goldmember, I was also the first assistant at first. But it ended up being almost like 2/3 camera operating, that job. And that was really my first official real movie as a B camera operator. And I made some mistakes, and there were a few shots in my first few movies that were just too challenging for a new operator. Ridiculously, like people moving so fast, or being put on the wheels when I wasn't good enough yet on the wheels to do that fast motion. You know, I could have done it on a fluid head, that sort of thing. So really, I mean, I would say to become good, pay attention to what the operator's doing. It's a much harder job than you think it is. I was a first assistant for years and years, right next to the operator, and I had no idea how hard it was. People won't tell you how to be an operator, partly because they don't want to give away their secrets, and partly because it's so intuitive, and partly because they learned by trial and error, so they think that's the best way. So even if you're physically good at it, you're going to make some mistakes in choice at the beginning. So the more experience you can get working as B camera on something, or volunteer to operate something for free or for cheap, the better it is. And then also go into rental houses and stick a laser or a small camera on top of a fluid or a set of wheels, a gearhead, and trace patterns on the wall. But better yet, follow people around, because tracing patterns you'll get to a point where you don't think about where your hand position is, but following people is a different animal, and it's something you should give a try.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think we're going to end this one off, and I think it was a great part one of this conversation. I will change the title of this live stream to part one, and then next week we will pick up with I think we're going into Barton Fink a little bit more. We'll take a look at some of those frames. We'll talk a little bit more about that experience, because I think we're going to talk about some of the challenges you had working on that Coen Brothers film. We've already started to talk about some of the epiphanies you had in terms of lighting. And for people who are interested in that, Deakins does have a forum, and he's doing a podcast right now. And there's plenty of information about sort of his approach to how he likes to light. And my understanding is it hasn't changed dramatically over the years. It's just the scale of the films he works on have gotten bigger. And that's something I'd like to talk with you. Let's just remember to do that, Scott, next week, which is, I think, one of the things that's overwhelming for people who are moving up in terms of, being in the camera department is scale. It's, you're working on these small projects with small crews, and you're in a living room, you're in the kitchen, and you're dealing with these smaller spaces, and maybe you're shooting some exteriors, but you're doing it to establish location, and then you're going into a smaller space on a park bench or whatever it is. But how do you scale as a cinematographer when those spaces become really large, and I'd love to get your take on that. As both a cinematographer and an educator, because I look at these scenes, and yes, there's a lot of special effects. Yes, there's a lot of CGI and things like that. But there's also times where you're shooting, downtown in a major city, and you're seeing down 3, 4, 5 blocks, and you have to light that, and you have to make decisions about what that is. So if you're okay to talk about that kind of stuff, that would be great too.
Sure, of course.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and click finish. Do you have anything else you want to say, Scott, before we finish this one up?
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next week, I guess.
Yeah, we'll see you next week at 9 a.m. Pacific, and it will be part 2 of this conversation with Scott Ressler. Thanks very much.
Thank you.